Have you ever wondered why a man grows uneasy, almost haunted, when a woman chooses to walk away before he is ready to lose her? In a world where male ego is often built on the illusion of control, this simple act becomes a psychological earthquake, reshaping everything he once believed about power, desire, and the feminine mystery that unsettles him far more than he will ever admit. When a woman walks away first, she disrupts the primordial narrative in which man pursues and woman concedes. She fractures the archetype, and in doing so, she awakens something ancient within him, something Jung insisted lies dormant in the shadow, waiting to confront him with truths he never asked to see. For the man, the woman who leaves first becomes an unresolvable symbol. She is no longer just a partner or a potential conquest. She becomes an image his unconscious cannot immediately categorize. She slips from his grasp and in that moment becomes mythic. Her absence becomes a riddle his ego cannot solve. The female figure who withdraws willingly activates the deepest layers of his animus projection, the internal feminine he has not yet integrated, the part of him he has been taught to distrust. And in that departure, you, if you have ever walked away, transform into a mirror he never wanted to look into. A mirror reflecting his inadequacy, his unhealed wounds, his unresolved fears, his boyhood echoes of abandonment. He may not say any of this aloud. He may not even know it consciously. But in the private chambers of his psyche, the narrative begins its quiet collapse. His mind replays your silence like a mysterious code he cannot decipher. He wonders why you no longer respond, why your warmth cooled into detachment, why your affection dissolved into quiet. He wonders how he missed the signs. He wonders why the power he believed he held never really belonged to him in the first place. Jung taught that what a man does not consciously face turns into fate, and the woman who walks away becomes the fate he did not choose but must now endure. To the outside world she may look calm, collected, unbothered. Yet beneath that stillness lies discipline, stoic, resolute, shaped by an inner dialogue that once pleaded for reciprocity, for tenderness, for consistency. But when those truths went ignored, she learned what Marcus Aurelius once wrote, that the soul becomes stronger when it refuses to depend on what is unstable. So she walked away not as punishment, but as self-preservation. And that calm, that clarity, that refusal to negotiate her worth, this is what terrifies him most. Because men sense the difference between the woman who leaves out of fear and the woman who leaves out of strength. The latter confronts him with the terrifying possibility that he was not as essential as he believed. When a woman steps back from a man who took her presence for granted, she becomes an invitation for him to confront the truth about himself. The truth he avoids. The truth he masks with indifference or arrogance or emotional distance. Seneca once said that the greatest bondage is to depend on something outside oneself. And men, far more than they admit, depend on feminine validation to feel powerful. The woman who walks away first refuses to fuel that dependency, and in doing so, she becomes the rare figure who does not orbit his ego but stands in her own autonomous center. This is where fear emerges, not as panic, but as an existential tremor. He fears that she has seen through him. He fears she has discovered the fragility behind his confidence. He fears that her departure is not a reaction but a revelation. You, if you have ever been this woman, know the moment it happens. The shift inside your chest when exhaustion becomes clarity. The moment your intuition, your greatest guardian, your internal oracle, tells you that staying costs your spirit more than leaving ever will. And once that knowing rises, there is no force that can pull you back into a space that suffocates your becoming. From that moment on, you embody the archetype of the liberated feminine, the one Jung associated with individuation, the courageous movement toward wholeness. A woman who walks away first becomes a woman who refuses to betray herself. She chooses growth over attachment, truth over fantasy, silence over chaos. She becomes the embodiment of the inner empress, the intuitive warrior, the sovereign self who answers to no one's wounds but her own healing. And this is what unsettles the masculine psyche, not her departure but her evolution. A woman walking away does not simply end a connection. She ends the version of him that expected her to stay. She forces him toward the confrontation he has avoided for years, the confrontation with his shadow, his unfinished emotional work, his unexamined beliefs about love and control. She becomes the catalyst for his reckoning. In the quiet aftermath of her departure, something begins to unravel inside him, not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle fractures that echo through his internal landscape. The woman who walks away first leaves behind a silence that functions like a psychological magnifying glass, enlarging everything he once avoided. In that silence, impressions surface he can no longer deny. Her absence becomes a presence of its own, a haunting reminder that the feminine is not meant to be captured but understood. And when he fails to understand her, he loses her. The masculine psyche, in its unrefined form, clings to the illusion that it is the one who grants value, who selects, who decides. Yet when a woman withdraws her emotional investment before he realizes its significance, she reveals a truth his ego never accounted for, that she too was choosing all along. And once that choice turns into refusal, it forces him to confront a reality more jarring than rejection. She saw what he offered, measured it against her own worth, and walked away because it was not enough for the woman she was becoming. This is the moment where fear mutates into introspection. The unfinished parts of him rise. The boy who feared not being enough, the adolescent who believed distance made him desirable, the man who never learned that intimacy requires reciprocity. Jung believed the shadow reveals itself through crisis, and the loss of a woman with emotional depth becomes such a crisis. She becomes the catalyst he didn't ask for but desperately needed. Her departure calls out the parts of himself he postponed, ignored, or concealed behind bravado. Meanwhile, the woman who walks away evolves through her own silent pilgrimage. In leaving, she is not abandoning connection. She is abandoning self-neglect. Her journey is inward, toward her intuition, the fierce compass that awakens in women the moment they stop silencing themselves for the comfort of another. The feminine archetype grows powerful not when she is adored, but when she is self-honoring. And this inner shift, more than her physical absence, is what shakes him. The moment she chooses her peace over his potential, she becomes untouchable in a way that transcends the physical bond they once shared. You may recognize this transformation within yourself, the sensation of returning to your own center after orbiting someone else's emotional gravity. It is not anger that guides you but clarity, not bitterness, but awakening. The woman who walks away does not do so to win. She does so to protect the sacred equilibrium of her inner world. She realizes that waiting for him to rise to the level of her heart is a form of self-abandonment. And once that realization takes root, she can no longer pretend she doesn't know better. Men who encounter such women often experience a paradoxical reaction. They fear her withdrawal even as they admire the strength it represents. She becomes the embodiment of the anima figure, a living reflection of everything he craves yet struggles to claim within himself. Her independence challenges him. Her calm disarms him. Her refusal to argue dismantles the defenses he built around his sensitivity. She triggers his shadow not through confrontation, but through the serene finality of her departure. He realizes too late that she was not asking for perfection, only presence. Not grand gestures, only emotional truth. The Stoics spoke often of the power of detachment, not as indifference, but as clarity. And the woman who leaves first often reaches that level of clarity long before he notices anything is wrong. She sees the future in the present. She feels the imbalance before it becomes unbearable. She senses when the emotional exchange no longer aligns with her spirit. And this foresight grants her the courage to leave before the situation collapses into resentment. To him, this foresight feels supernatural, almost threatening. He cannot understand how she saw what he missed. He cannot understand how she loved deeply yet left calmly. He cannot comprehend how a woman can care and still choose distance over dysfunction. But this is the paradox of the empowered feminine. Her heart is vast, but her boundaries are immovable. She knows that connection without integrity is a wound waiting to happen. And so he fears her, not because she harms him, but because she awakens him. She exposes the gap between his potential and his reality. She forces him to confront the emotional muscles he never developed. She reveals the fragility beneath the surface confidence he wears like armor. Her departure becomes the initiation his soul avoided but secretly needed. It is not cruelty that shapes her choice, it is evolution. And evolution waits for no one who refuses to grow. In the vacuum of her absence, he is left with only himself. And that is where the real fear begins. In the space she leaves behind, a man meets the version of himself he has long avoided, unshielded, unembellished, unguarded. The woman who walks away first forces him into an encounter with his own interior world, the world he has drowned out with noise, distraction, and emotional shortcuts. Her absence pulls away the curtain, revealing the unprocessed wounds he stitched together with temporary connections and half-formed promises. Without her presence buffering his insecurities, he stands alone before the unhealed architecture of his psyche. This confrontation is not gentle. It is not soothing. Jung warned that the shadow emerges with a ferocity that can destabilize the unprepared. And for a man who has not developed the emotional resilience to look inward, the absence of the woman who once anchored him feels like a psychic fracture. He fears her because she represented the emotional mirror he never wanted to face. She reflected back the truth of who he was when he stopped performing. She felt the tremors beneath his bravado, sensed the patterns he repeated, and saw the man he could become if he ever dared to grow. Now in her distance, all those truths echo. The silence becomes a teacher, the strict, unrelenting kind. He begins to understand that she did not leave out of impulse but out of necessity. He recalls the small moments when she withdrew slightly, the quiet winces she thought he didn't notice, the way she held her breath during his detachment. These memories return like fragments of a dream that suddenly makes sense. He realizes that she loved him with a kind of tenderness he mistook for permanence. He believed her willingness to stay meant she always would, and this miscalculation becomes the heart of his fear. He lost the woman who actually cared. Meanwhile, she undergoes her own metamorphosis. The woman who walks away is not running from love. She is walking towards self-restoration. She is rebuilding the parts of herself that dimmed in the shadow of his inconsistency. She reclaims her inner landscape, piece by piece, understanding now that no relationship, no matter how intoxicating, should compromise the integrity of her inner truth. This is where her power crystallizes. She becomes the embodiment of the feminine principle that Jung described as intuitive, wise, and fiercely individuated. Her journey inward reconnects her to her own source, the energy that nourishes her heart without depending on another's validation. You may recognize this inner shift, the moment your exhaustion became enlightenment, when your tears transformed into clarity and your longing dissolved into neutrality. It is not that you stop caring, it is that you stop compromising your spirit in exchange for temporary affection. This is the alchemy of feminine empowerment, transforming pain into discernment, attachment into sovereignty, hope into quiet strength. The woman who walks away first becomes a woman who listens to her intuition more closely than she listens to her fear. And somewhere inside him, a realization forms like a bruise. He begins to understand that she was not demanding too much. She was asking for what he had not yet learned to give: emotional presence, consistency, vulnerability. These qualities require a kind of courage he never exercised, and now the opportunity to show them has slipped through his fingers. Seneca wrote that misfortune reveals the true quality of a person's mind, and in this misfortune, the loss of her, he sees the truth of his emotional immaturity. He begins to understand that he was not rejected for being unlovable, but for being unavailable. This distinction awakens a fear deeper than abandonment. It is the fear of inadequacy, the fear that he was not strong enough to meet the emotional standard she lived by. For it was not her expectations that were high, but her spirit. And to connect with a woman of such depth requires the kind of inner work that most men postpone until loss forces them into it. Her absence becomes his catalyst. Her silence becomes his initiation. Her decision to walk away becomes the lesson that reshapes him far more than her presence ever did. He begins to question the emotional patterns he once dismissed. The late replies, the half-hearted effort, the reluctance to express vulnerability. He sees now how they chipped away at her trust. Each hesitation, each emotional withdrawal, each moment of selfishness becomes a memory heavy with consequence. And this realization does not punish him, it transforms him. But transformation, especially for the masculine psyche, often begins in discomfort. He begins to recognize that she represented not only love but evolution. She challenged his stagnation simply by being herself. She brought emotional depth to a life he had numbed. She illuminated the emotional territory he avoided exploring. And when she walked away, she carried that illumination with her, leaving him in the dim glow of his own avoidance. This is why he fears her, because she was not just a woman, she was an awakening. In the dim corridors of his mind, the awakening she triggered refuses to fade. It pulses like a quiet heartbeat, steady and unrelenting, reminding him that her departure was not merely an ending but a revelation. The woman who walks away first becomes an archetype that reshapes his understanding of connection itself. She is no longer a singular memory. She becomes the symbol of everything he was not prepared to face. Her absence becomes a psychological event, a rupture through which truths seep in like cold air through cracks in a forgotten room, and he cannot escape the draft that follows. What unsettles him most is not that she left, but that she left without theatrics. She did not scream, plead, or beg for reciprocity. She did not try to convince him of her worth. She did not set herself on fire to warm a bond he had already allowed to cool. Instead, she simply withdrew, quietly reclaiming her power, her dignity, her emotional center. This grace in departure unnerves him because it reveals a level of self-possession he never imagined she held. He realizes too late that her silence was never weakness. It was wisdom. It was discernment. It was the final expression of love she had for herself. Jung believed that the feminine contains a hidden spiritual authority, a capacity to transform reality not through force but through presence. And when that presence is withheld, its power becomes unmistakable. In her absence, the imprint of her energy lingers, the way she listened, the way she felt deeply, the way she saw through him with an intuitive clarity he never understood. Men fear what they cannot comprehend, and the intuitive woman is the greatest mystery of all. She is a psychological riddle, a spiritual phenomenon, a mirror to his unspoken truths. Without her, the landscape of his life shifts. The casual distractions lose their appeal. The surface-level connections feel hollow. The validation he once sought from external sources no longer satisfies. For in losing her, he realizes that he has lost access to the emotional depth he once resisted. She was the doorway to a more honest version of himself, and now that door is closed, not locked, but inaccessible because she is no longer there to open it. The woman who walks away becomes a ghost in his psyche, not haunting him maliciously, but reminding him of everything genuine he failed to nurture. She becomes the echo that follows him into new relationships, the memory that surfaces during moments of stillness. Not because she seeks revenge, but because he cannot forget the woman who embodied what he secretly desired, yet lacked the courage to honor. And while he revisits the past, she walks steadily into her own becoming. Her departure was not the end of her story. It was the catalyst for her rebirth. The feminine spirit regenerates in silence, in solitude, in the soft spaces where intuition speaks louder than fear. She uncovers the parts of herself she buried beneath compromise. She relearns the sound of her own heartbeat. She restores her boundaries with the gentle authority of someone who has outgrown the need to be chosen by someone unprepared for her depth. You may feel this evolution within yourself, the strange, empowering sensation of rediscovering your own reflection after losing yourself trying to understand another. The woman who walks away first does not abandon love. She abandons self-sacrifice disguised as love. She remembers that real intimacy cannot flourish in imbalance. She understands now that a connection cannot survive on hope alone. It requires reciprocity, presence, emotional truth. And once she accepts this, she no longer feels guilt for leaving. She feels relief. As she rises, the energy around her shifts. She becomes less accessible, less malleable, less willing to entertain half-hearted efforts. Her standards refine not from bitterness but from clarity. The world tries to label her as cold, guarded, detached, but in reality, she is simply self-aware. She has tasted the cost of self-abandonment and refuses to pay it again. Her softness remains, but it is held within boundaries forged by experience. Meanwhile, he begins to recognize the cost of his own avoidance. He remembers the time she reached for him emotionally and he turned away, believing he had time to grow at his own pace. He recalls the moment she expressed hurt and he deflected, assuming her loyalty was unconditional. He sees now that love is not something one keeps by default. It is something one must tend to, nurture, honor. And in her departure, he confronts the truth that he failed not because he was unloved, but because he refused to evolve. The fear he carries is no longer fear of losing her. It is fear of never meeting another woman who sees him with such clarity, who loves with such sincerity, who challenges him so effortlessly. For the woman who walks away first becomes the standard by which he will measure all future connections, often without realizing it. She becomes the turning point in his emotional maturation, the reminder that love without growth is merely attachment dressed as security. In this way, she becomes not only his past but his lesson, an initiation into the truth that emotional intimacy is not a given but a discipline, and he fears her because she taught him this truth without ever intending to. As time stretches forward, something else begins to awaken within him, an uncomfortable, humbling realization that the woman who walked away first did not simply exit his life. She elevated the very landscape of his emotional understanding. In losing her, he loses the unspoken guidance she offered through her softness, her presence, her intuitive intelligence. What remains is a hollow space that no distraction can fill, because the absence of a woman who knows her worth is not merely an empty room. It is an echoing cathedral of unmet potential. Every footstep inside it reminds him of what he could have been if he had chosen to grow alongside her instead of resisting the vulnerability she invited. It is only now that he recognizes the silent labor she carried, the emotional weight she lifted, the unspoken forgiveness she gave with each attempt to understand him. The way she smoothed the rough edges of his moods with empathy rather than judgment. These qualities were invisible to him when he believed her presence was guaranteed, but in her absence, they shine like constellations he failed to trace when she was within reach. Jung once wrote that the most significant events in life often occur internally, unseen by others, and her departure becomes one of these invisible earthquakes, reshaping his inner world in ways he could never have predicted. For the woman who leaves first is not driven by spite. She is driven by an instinct older than logic, rooted in her emotional survival. She senses the moment when the relationship becomes stagnant, when the exchange tilts into imbalance, when her compassion becomes a resource he consumes rather than reciprocates. This intuition is the compass of the feminine psyche, the inner oracle that whispers truths long before the mind is ready to admit them. And when she finally chooses to heed that whisper, her departure becomes an act of self-honoring. You may recognize this inner clarity. It arrives without fanfare, without dramatic pronouncements. It comes as a subtle shift, a quiet knowing that you deserve a love that does not require you to shrink, a love that does not punish your sensitivity or exploit your loyalty, a love that rises to meet you, rather than asking you to dim your light to soothe another's fear of intimacy. When this understanding takes root, your heart stops negotiating with realities that cannot sustain your spirit. This is the moment every empowered woman knows, the moment she walks away not because she is done loving but because she is done abandoning herself. In her absence, he begins to see the architecture of healthy love with a clarity he lacked before. He realizes that emotional maturity is not a natural byproduct of age or experience. It is a discipline, a choice, a daily undertaking. Her departure initiates him into this truth. He understands now that love demands presence, effort, vulnerability. That connection cannot survive on potential or promises or charm. That real intimacy requires a man to confront his own shadow, rather than projecting it onto the woman who stands before him. And yet, the most profound realization dawned slowly. She did not leave because he was unworthy. She left because he was not ready. Her love required him to rise, to grow, to step into a version of himself he was still resisting. This understanding softens the fear he once held toward her. It transforms into reverence, not idealization, not regret but recognition. Recognition that she was not an ending he failed to prevent, but a threshold he was unprepared to cross. Meanwhile, she moves through her own rebirth with a quiet strength. Her solitude becomes sacred. She finds herself in the spaces where her voice is no longer drowned out by compromise. She rebuilds the connection with her intuition, the most ancient ally of the feminine spirit. She learns to trust herself again, to follow the emotional compass she once doubted. The fragments of her identity realign, forming a woman who is both softer and stronger, more open yet more discerning, loving yet boundaried. This transformation is the true source of her power. She no longer seeks validation from those who cannot meet her. She no longer performs for affection or negotiates her boundaries in exchange for temporary comfort. She walks with a serenity shaped by experience, guided by a wisdom carved from silence. The world around her shifts in response. Opportunities align, connections deepen, relationships refine. She becomes magnetic not because she chases, but because she has become the embodiment of self-respect. And if their paths cross again, he will see her differently, not as the woman he lost, but as the woman who became whole in the absence of his presence. He will recognize that her departure was not a rejection but a return, to herself, to her intuition, to her inner equilibrium. And in that recognition, he will understand the truth he feared all along, that the woman who walks away first is the woman who knows her worth. She does not flee, she ascends. And there, in the final breath of realization, lies the essence of her power. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.